Welcome back, everyone. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Katharina Gerstenberger, all the way from the University of Utah. Pleasure to have you here. I'll let you begin.
Thank you, and I'd like to begin by thanking the Simon and the organizers for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope I can keep you engaged and entertained at this after lunch hour. So the topic of my talk is anxiety in the Anthropocene, climate change in literary fiction. The 2009 report by the American Psychological Association's Task Force on the Interface between Psychology and Global Climate Change makes the argument that an understanding of the psychological dimensions of climate change is crucial if we are to be successful in curbing global warming. Climate change, the report suggests, I quote, may result in increased stress and anxiety. Even in the absence of direct impacts, the perception and fear of climate change may threaten mental health. Emotional responses, the report further notes, can lead to denial and thus prevent individuals from recognizing the severity of the dangers. In a more recent APA report from March 2017, a psychologist states in the document's concluding section that I am seeing a growing number of climate Cassandras gripped by thoughts of future harm, suffering from pre-traumatic stress response, a before-the-fact version of classic PTSD, because they know the world has not heard the warnings forcefully enough. On the other hand, according to a 2014 survey conducted by the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication and the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, less than 1% of the respondents listed mental health impacts as a possible consequence of climate change, the lowest of all categories in response to a question probing the participants' knowledge regarding the effects of global warming on health. This contrast is as telling as it is unsurprising. Keeping in mind the different origins of these reports, the discrepancies point to the challenges of climate communication in general and the ambivalent role of climate anxiety in this larger context. The sociologist Kari Marie Norgaard makes a similar observation in her 2011 study, Living in Denial, about a Norwegian small-town community when she remarks that the population is quite well informed about climate change, the effects of which people observe firsthand, but nevertheless deny what they're experiencing to avoid feelings of fear but also guilt. In a chapter about the US, Norgaard reports that Americans, though generally less well informed than Norwegians and more skeptical about the science of climate change, resort to similar strategies to avoid the internal agony caused by a combination of awareness and the uncertainty about what to do, suggesting that in either case it is this quality of angst that essentially makes climate change unthinkable. Media scholar Maxwell T. Boykoff confirms this conclusion when he notes that fear-inducing tones in climate change stories can inspire feelings of paralysis. Climate anxiety, according to these brief examples from a variety of disciplines, is a widespread yet possibly debilitating and certainly ineffective response to the stories we hear, read, watch, or create ourselves about our changing climate. The arousal of fear and anxiety, of course, is also a common narrative device across a variety of genres, both nonfiction and fiction, deployed to create interest, to entertain, and to incite action. In my presentation today, I wish to address the representation of climate change in literature, especially the depiction of negative emotions in response to it, meaning climate change. My point of departure here is the notion that fiction is uniquely positioned to explore human emotions and, in turn, to elicit emotional as well as intellectual responses by inviting the reader into complex yet delimited realities. I will begin by looking at Indian writer and essayist Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, a work that is based on 4 lectures presented at the University of Chicago in the fall of 2015. In the opening passages of these essays, Ghosh, who has written a number of major historical novels as well as works dealing with environmental problems, asks why the mention of climate change in a work of literature tends to result in its exclusion from the realm of serious fiction, which to him is a failure of writers as much as the reading public to engage seriously with one of the most serious issues of our time. The climate crisis for Ghosh is therefore also a crisis of culture. His far-reaching deliberations regarding the challenges involved in combating climate change include reference to the history of colonialism and the asymmetrical participation of different nations in the fossil fuel economy, the impact of capitalism as a consumption-driven form of economy, as well as the unsuitability of the nation-state to address this global problem, as nations tend to defend their borders and perceived rights. Importantly, Ghosh, who thinks in broad contexts and connections, rejects appeals to the individual's conscience because the moral political can produce paralysis, an argument that echoes the observations of the psychologists, sociologists, and media scholars I quoted above, and furthermore, again according to Ghosh, indicates the acceptance of neoliberal premises, as in we're all responsible for our own fate and deeds. What is needed instead, according to Ghosh, is a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we are all trapped. Writers of fiction, of course, have over the past 200 or so years created elaborate imaginaries centered on the sovereign individual. So to move beyond the great derangement of human overestimation and to curb climate change, we must realize, both in art and in life, that freedom is not limitless, but has to take into consideration other beings as well, human as well as non-human. Ghosh therefore argues that Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si and its acknowledgement of the limits of human agency is more valuable than the 2015 Paris Agreement with its faith in the human ability to shape the future. In his conclusion, he suggests that any way out of this crisis is intimately related to the idea of the sacred, by which he means overcoming isolationist views of humans and the ability to view ourselves in deep connection to other beings. Ghosh's reflections and suggestions for new forms of literary representations of climate change go, from what I can tell, well beyond what existing literature offers, and I would say including his own work of fiction. Yet his essays are a powerful exploration of how we might approach climate change beyond catastrophic thinking and without allowing anxiety to paralyze us. If we can do that, there's hope, at least for Ghosh, and I would want to join him there, that the Great Derangement will have been a phase in human history for future historians to contemplate. I will now talk in more detail about the Lamentations of Zeno. That's a climate change novel by Bulgarian-born writer Ilija Trojanow. Originally published in German in 2011 under the title Ice Tau, and that's a neologism that literally translates into ice melt. The English title, The Lamentations of Zeno, shifts the focus from the physical consequences of global warming to the suffering of the main protagonist, and furthermore, invokes a religious dimension by alluding to the prophet Jeremiah's laments over the destruction of Jerusalem. Born in 1965, Trojanow, whose family fled Bulgaria when he was a child and who writes most of his work in German, counts among Germany's most politically outspoken writers. He's most famous for his 2006 novel, The Collector of Worlds, about the British explorer, writer, and translator Richard Francis Burton and his travels from India to Arabia and Africa, a work that established Trojanow's reputation as a writer of transnational literature. Defining climate change as a problem about which we know a lot but do very little, the Lamentations of Zeno approaches the topic through the lens of an individual figure and his emotional response to the threats posed by rising temperatures. The main protagonist, Zeno Hintermeyer, is a glaciologist who descends into depression as the object of his study, a glacier in the Austrian Alps, dies due to global warming. Having quit his job at the university, he now shares his expertise about ice with affluent tourists on a cruise ship sailing from southern Argentina to the Antarctic Peninsula. With a scientist as a main character, Lamentations probes the possibilities and limitations of educating the public about climate change. Taking up the, at this point, regularly posed question as to why it is so difficult to get people to act on a problem about whose severity they tend to be well informed. It also examines the emotional effects on a protagonist who must come to terms with his inability to inspire political action. So the novel operates on three levels. It addresses one of the most pressing issues of our time, namely climate change. It probes the possibilities of political engagement through its protagonists and plot, and it reflects on the relationship between art and politics. Lamentations is rendered in form of a personal notebook in which Zeno describes the cruise ship's journey from Argentina to Antarctica, interspersed with memories of his childhood in Bavaria, his failed marriage, his relationship with his admired teacher, and the interaction with his own students. Along with the ship's trajectory, the reader follows Zeno's development from his early interest in ice to becoming a passionate and highly accomplished glaciologist, to his grief over the loss of his glacier, over time turning increasingly aggressive and misanthropic. The plot illustrates this through controversies between Zeno and other staff members on the cruise ship, tense encounters with passengers, including an American artist intent on making his own creative statement about glacial melting, and an altercation with a Chilean soldier over a cigarette stump disposed among a colony of penguins. Towards the end of the novel, Zeno hijacks the cruise ship while the passengers are on shore forming a human SOS sign as participants in a performance project. The reader thus becomes witness to a process of political radicalization and emotional deterioration that ends with Zeno taking his own life by jumping off the ship into the icy ocean. In between the diary entries are short segments of text which Philip Boehm, that's the novel's translator into English, has described as bricolage passages. They contain a running commentary of sorts on the story of the hijacked ship, offered by a range of unnamed voices who pick up on the topics of Zeno's narrative, including the exploitation of natural resources and the intricacies of the tourism industry, creating an echo effect of sorts, yet missing any and all of Zeno's suffering and intentions. A response to and context for Zeno's act of protest and self-destruction, these sections call into question the possibility of effective communication and mimic the mass media's pursuit of breaking news instead of striving to transmit reliable information. If Zeno's mission to educate the public about global warming fails in the end, the neutralization of its intent through the media carries at least part of the blame. Lamentations includes a number of passages that contemplate political action and the possibility of change. The novel rehearses several models, including performance art, journalism, scientific research, education of the public, and finally violence and hijacking, none of which is portrayed as successful. The opening scene sets the tone when an old bartender in the Patagonian town of Ushuaia berates Zeno for being a scoundrel because he is nothing but talk and accepts what can be avoided. Knowledge that does not result in action, he suggests, is worse than ignorance, contending that Zeno misapplies his deep familiarity with the geography and history of Antarctica merely to make money off rich tourists. The ship, as several commentators on Trojanow's novel have pointed out, is a traditional literary space and microcosm for human behavior, or, as Trojanow himself has expressed it, an allegory of power and resistance in the tiniest of spaces. In this case, it is also a testing ground for political engagement. The incident with the barkeeper inspires Zeno to reflect on his own implication in the destruction of the earth and leads to his resolve: something has to happen. There is no time to waste. At the same time, he rejects more measured and patient arguments, be they presented in the form of science or through art or journalism, as ineffective. Humans, to him, are destroyers of the natural environment, even though several characters point out to him that this judgment might be too harsh. About his own emotional development, Zeno notes, "My sadness scabbed over into rage." In a conversation about climate change communication, a fellow scientist points out to Zeno that prophecies in the tradition of the Delphi oracle might be more effective than any scientific projection or prognosis, noting that it was Gaia, the earth goddess, whom the ancient Greeks worshipped in Delphi, and hinting at the possible power of the sacred. Asked whether he himself has turned away from science, Zeno remarks, "On the contrary, I'm just planning to give my next warning in a different way." With all passengers and crew off board for the performance project, the formation of a human SOS sign on an ice floe, Zeno seizes the opportunity to hijack the ship and thus bring about the moment when art becomes reality. His subsequent suicide in the ocean is preceded by the confession that he is tired of being human, not tired of being me, just tired of being human. And a little later, the realization, much too late, that you didn't do anything when you still could, when you still should have, that is hell, and there's no escape. Zeno here shows the symptoms described in the APA report and other pertinent literature that guilt for being human, for not doing enough, can lead to debilitating anxiety or, in this case, suicide. His story also, I believe, confirms Amitav Ghosh's suggestion that the moral political can produce paralysis. In the end, the outcome is Zeno's self-destruction and, of course, his notebook and the story with its reflection on political action as both necessary and futile, and a chronicle of his emotional demise. The stranded passengers will be rescued without any insights into Zeno's suffering on account of global warming or understanding his desperate plea for the preservation of the Antarctic ice shelf. Climate change communication in this novel breaks down at every level. Critical responses to the Lamentations of Zeno were somewhat tepid, acknowledging the importance of the topic and appreciating the amount of scientific and historical information Trojanow worked into his text, but finding the novel overly didactic and lacking in artistic quality. An alternative reading might be to say that Lamentations does a good job of illustrating the paralysis caused by climate anxiety, or, to borrow E.N. Kaplan's phrase, a full-blown pre-trauma caused by the anticipation of the climate catastrophes that are certain to come. At the same time, Trojanow's text also offers a nuanced description of the very challenges scholars of climate change communication point to as well when they analyze the complex relationship between scientific facts on one hand and their reception and meaning in a given culture on the other. A good novel, of course, does not have to solve the problems it describes. So instead of reading Lamentations as a failed or less than entirely successful climate change novel, we can appreciate the text as an astute reckoning with climate anxiety, rage, and, as the Germanist Axel Goodbody has said, the extremes of apocalyptic pessimism this can produce. In the introduction to his recent study, Anthropocene Fictions, the novel In a Time of Climate Change, Adam Traxler suggests that climate fiction can convey cultural narratives, making the novel a privileged form to explore what it means to live in the Anthropocene moment. A statement like this resonates with Mike Hume's suggestion, the preface to his 2009 study, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, that, I quote, "We need to reveal the creative, psychological, spiritual, and ethical work that climate change can do and is doing for us." He actually repeats that same line in the conclusion of this book. By his own account, Ilija Trojanow is an anarchist who rejects organized party politics and political movements. To him, anarchism's ideological fuzziness, that's his term, is precisely its strength. Yet Trojanow also describes himself as someone who has a connection to the spiritual that allows him to participate in a religion's, and in his case that's Islam's, richness without subscribing to its ideology and without conversion to that religion. So if he chooses to write another climate change novel, perhaps he will draw on those spiritual aspects of his self. So in conclusion, I would like to assert that fiction has indeed rich and complex contributions to make to climate change communication, both embedded in its plot and through its voices and as a participant in the conversation in general. Based on this brief interpretation of Trojanow's novel, I would hope that writers of fiction will want to explore further the ways in which they can express what Amitav Ghosh has described as the sacred, however one may wish to conceive of it. This means for fiction, as for everybody else, that we need to conceive of spatial and temporal dimensions as well beyond an individual's experience or lifetime. It also means that we need to use the human ability to place ourselves in someone else's position much more radically. Then perhaps we can move from anxiety to creativity and develop forms of communication that can achieve support for the cultural shifts that will be necessary to combat climate change. Thank you. Yeah.
Anyone? No? Okay. Oh, one
Oh, there gotta be questions. Come on.
Hello, I'm sorry to ask a rather minor question about such an interesting paper, because obviously, unfortunately, I haven't read the book. But when you describe the author's revelation of his own sort of ideological commitments, and you said he described himself as an anarchist,
yes,
and
yes.
And then you said, but also this religious. I got a sense, and maybe I'm wrong, that you were contrasting the two as if the two were potentially not.
I'm urging, obviously, he'll do whatever he will do. I'm sort of based on my reading on the novel and what I got out of Amitav Ghosh's, I think, very, very insightful book. I'm just trying to bring the two together sort of as a suggestion, as a gesture towards the other, to bring them together. I don't necessarily see it as a contrast. I'm sure Trojanow himself, who's a very, very eloquent people, who has a significant presence in the public sphere through his website, interviews that you can find on YouTube. He certainly would say this is not a contradiction. I mean, he's a sort of post-ideological kind of a person. Anything can be brought in context with anything and made productive. That's probably what he would answer.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I was only going to say it was just a minor thing, you know, on the religious anarchists of, you know, the Tolstoy and all that sort of, you know, there is that kind of tradition of bringing the two together.
Well, actually, now that you mention this, I mean, he, as I said, he's a very prolific writer, and he has an essay where he actually explains his own anarchism, and he does go back to Tolstoy.
Oh, that's
so he does make that connection. Yes, no.
I'm sorry to. It was a very minor point at the end, but thank you very much indeed. Fascinating.
Katharina, I have maybe also another very minor question. Climate and the human psyche, or climate and emotional life, and so on. Now, it seems to me there are two things here. You're talking about the impact that the idea of climate change, the belief in climate change and its potentially catastrophic implications may have on the human psyche. But there's a whole other literature on the way in which climate affects our emotional life. People feel more angry in their vehicles on a hot day. And, Are there increased numbers of suicides in particular temperature? Are these two literatures linked in any way at all, or are they quite separate?
To be honest, honest answer is I don't know. I mean, what I've read and researched for this paper is about anxiety caused by the doomsday scenario and the coming catastrophe. Whether they're related, I'm not aware of anything, but I mean that doesn't actually really say very much. They might well be connected. But to me, it was interesting that actually, something like the APA and others actually do research on this. And I'll say, yes, it's a serious mental health issue. I mean, I could have quoted more examples. So there's quite a bit of research out there, and sort of the APA's intention certainly is also to bring this out and it's beautifully written. They have a sort of a mission statement. They actually want to help put people in a position to combat climate change. I mean, it's on their part. It's I think a very valuable and constructive gesture to understand this issue and help do something about it. But whether there are also sort of actual effects on, I really don't know.
Just wanted to ask if there is a genre of climate change literature, is there a danger of it being marginalised and subsumed into science fiction and perhaps not, being noticed so much or read so much?
Well, I mean that's a good question. I mean it's a relatively new genre. I think there's more literature out there currently, sort of, as far as I'm familiar with, certainly in the English language, American, probably also British context, rather than the German context. The Germans are beginning to discover this now. There are scholarly book articles and the first books out on the topic, and I think scholars, obviously sort of people like myself who are quite concerned about this, are trying to make sure actually that the scholarly community and the reading public knows about this, and they're trying to establish this as a serious genre. I mean, what Ghosh, who himself is an accomplished writer, he sort of wants to distinguish between science fiction, which to him is not necessarily serious, and sort of more what he calls sort of serious fiction. There are bound to be people out there too who would actually challenge him on that and say that that science fiction, of course, can also be serious fiction as well. But I think it's being taken seriously by writers and readers and scholars, and my predictions, we're going to see more of that. But the challenge really is, how do you represent these issues? Because I mean, a novel sort of will focus on individual human beings, characters, right? And it's a problem that sort of exceeds our imagination quite literally, our temporal frames. And then the question that Ghosh asked, I think, very eloquently is, well, how do you do this actually? So I mean, what he does, if you're interested in this, I would definitely recommend this book. It's beautifully written and crafted and very well founded in history and politics, in literature studies. He says we need to take this very seriously to develop forms that do justice to the problems that face us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talking about the effects that climate change and the knowledge that people have about it, and the mental health effects that can have. And as a teacher and artist, and seeing my students engage in the subject over the last month, there's definitely been a raised awareness of the subject, but that can lead to concerns and possible mental health issues. Yeah. And then also you're talking about fiction and writing books, but also art can be a way of, I think people need to feel empowered to make a change in the world through art, but also that in itself can lead to anxiety and frustration. For example, the work's up there on the top floor, and I see people walking past in the street, and I think, you know, my students have spent a month creating all this work, and and I've seen them go from having no knowledge whatsoever, more or less, other than, you know, don't throw plastic in the street, and they've become so inspired, and that can give them and me a feeling that everyone needs to be doing this, you know, and then that can also lead to anxiety and depression for the artist or the writer when people don't engage. So I think ultimately you have to accept a feeling of powerlessness in some ways, because else you would just drive you insane, wouldn't it?
I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's a very good observation. It's a very good observation. I think the strength of this novel here is actually to begin to put this into words. It doesn't give us a solution, but sort of the anxieties and the impasses that this, whether you're a scientist or an artist or a writer, that this problem produces. And maybe we need to think, well, maybe there can be a next step, sort of how we can move out of this anxiety. I'm sure the creation of art is a step in that direction, and act, because I mean ultimately we need to do that. But I mean it is a wicked problem, right? I mean, not just as far as the science is concerned, but also the humanities, sociology. What do we do with this, no? We have a lot of very good information, but now what? No? And then, as I was working on this, to me it's a relatively new topic. I was amazed and impressed how many interesting studies are out there now on the well, why we disagree, and that's the human, why we disagree about climate change. I mean, people have put a lot of thought into why it is so difficult to communicate and to come to a consensus, and I don't think it's because the science is ambiguous. They have their disagreements too, but I don't think that's the heart of the matter. It's really culture, as I think Ghosh says rightly so. Yeah.
Katharina Gerstenberger.
Yes, thank you.